Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. In this episode, I thought that we would discuss the relationship between David and Jonathan. Was it a homosexual relationship, or was it not? Now, first, though, I'm going to present the affirmative argument in that David and Jonathan were, in fact, in a homosexual relationship, followed by the counter-argument, or the traditional argument, in that David and Jonathan were not in a homosexual relationship. So if you guys like this sort of content and wish to see the channel grow, please hit that like button and make sure you guys are subscribed in order to receive future notifications on any upcoming videos. If you should like to support the channel financially, or at least pledge a donation, I will also leave a link to my Patreon in the description below, along with the sources I used to make this video. So without further ado, let's delve into the topic. First off, the affirmative argument. Now, the argument that the relationship between David and Jonathan was homosexual was put forth first, at least to my knowledge, by Dr. Tom Horner in the 70s in his book entitled Jonathan Loved David, Homosexuality in Biblical Times. Horner begins his argument with the Epic of Gilgamesh challenging the status quo that both Gilgamesh and Enkidu were in a homosexual relationship. He builds his argument around the idea that they embraced and kissed each other, thereby forming a friendship. Horner then observes that their friendship blossomed and grew even deeper after Gilgamesh incurred the wrath of Ishtar by rejecting the fertility goddess' pleas of marriage while seemingly pursuing or pining for Enkidu. After the death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh sought after eternal life, but Horner adds strangely that Gilgamesh could have been searching for a way to communicate with Enkidu, concluding that the reader cannot deny the homosexual relationship between the pair. Dr. Horner then relates this account to ancient Near Eastern kings, asserting that these kings certainly had loyal friends in the same way that King David had loyal friends, much like Jonathan. Horner matter-of-factly posits as well that it was not the religious aspects of the Gilgamesh epic that were the base of its appeal, let alone its qualities as an adventure story, but rather the kind of love that the story depicted must have been popular with kings. They needed such close and loyal friends of love relationships usually, but not exclusively between two men who were closely associated as well in a military context. He builds on this argument using examples of Alexander the Great and Hadrian, who both had relationships with Hephaestion and Antinous, respectively. Horner then claims the same thing for both David and Jonathan, whom he likens Jonathan to Hephaestion and Antinous. He supports this claim through 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1, which reads that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, in addition to 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 26b, which reads that your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing even the love of women. In the following chapter, Horner gives, of his book, I should say, in the following chapter of his book, Horner gives some context to 1 Samuel 17 and 18, stating rightfully that the Philistines did inhabit the southwest coast of the Levant during the Iron Age. However, Horner makes the unusual claim that the Philistines, who hail from Greece and were one of the groups of the Sea Peoples, influenced the Israelites, and as a result, David and Jonathan. Horner avers here as well that the Israelites lived in the shadow of the Philistines for 200 years, and that the Philistines also accepted homosexuality. He states that when one of them is socially superior of the two makes a public display of his love, makes a lifetime pact, and finally meets secretly and kisses, we have every reason to believe that David and Jonathan were homosexual. Old Testament scholar Nolan Fewell, in her book Gender, Power, and Promise, the subject of the Bible's first story, builds on Horner's work, arguing that the homosexual relationship was subverted by later editors because of cultural abhorrence of homosexuality. Although Fewell explores gender relations in the Old Testament, Fewell reasons that in David's lament for the death of both Saul and Jonathan, we can hear another message whilst David expresses his love for Jonathan. She states that David expresses his extreme love for Jonathan, arguing that usually in the text, David is the object of everyone's gaze. But here it is the opposite, in that Jonathan is the object of David's gaze. Fewell argues that Jonathan is in the place of women, and additionally Fewell argues that Jonathan is also a son of perversity and rebellion, citing 1 Samuel 20, verse 30, that he puts every woman to shame. The explicit tone is different in each case, but the construction of Jonathan's sexuality by Saul and David is the same. Ultimately, that Jonathan is a woman, possibly more woman than women are. Old Testament scholar Dr. David Jobling corroborates Fewell here, affirming that the namelessness of many of the Bible's female characters is often read as a failure to ascribe a real subjectivity to women. Jobling adds that monarchy will occasionally produce a reigning queen because of the failure of the male line, even though this is rather irregular. And finally, Jobling also accuses Saul of homophobia, realizing the possibility that is confirmed when Saul brings Jonathan's choice of David directly into the realm of the sexual in 1 Samuel 20 verse 30. Jobling cites key words and phrases like, "to the shame of your mother's genitalia," implying that Saul is attempting to transfer the blame for Jonathan's behavior to his mother, observing therefore that a homosexual man is a mother's boy is rather common of homophobia. Jobling concludes that the text is open to a homosexual reading, and this is no bland statement, for one can easily see ways in which it could have discouraged such a reading. The non-trivial, politically important claim stands that the Bible here shows itself able to say what it has to say through the dynamics of what appears to be a homosexual relationship. Moreover, the role of women in the monarchy is simple but essential, and that is to produce an heir, implicitly revealing how little the expectations of women are or were in the patriarchy. Fewell realizes that David is rather astute as well, continuing the narrative in 2 Samuel 19 verse 27. Having enjoyed every advantage of Jonathan's attachment, he is now able to capitalize. David publicly announces what the royal court seemingly already knew by seizing the opportunity to define the relationship. Moreover, he proclaims himself the object of his affection. Furthermore, finally, Fewell avers that Jonathan's loveliness and love become political, where the love of Jonathan possesses for David becomes a comparison with women involving the stereotype of the patriarchy. Now for the counter-argument. Some interpreters of this view claim that the text has forced an injustice on readers because the true homosexual nature of the relationship has been suppressed by both ancient editors and modern scholars, particularly with Saul and his rage, whom Jobling accuses of homophobia. More on that later. The problem is that we possess no text, evidence, or pre-existing accounts revealing anything of this nature. Old Testament scholar Dr. Bill T. Arnold contradicts Fewell here, stating that it must be as much of an injustice to today's heterosexual readers to subvert the obvious face value of the canonical text, and to deny that David and Jonathan should have had a loving commitment to each other that was not sexual. Moreover, Arnold states that the ancient patriarchal societies lost the original, codependent, and egalitarian ideals of creation, spelt out in Genesis 1:27. Additionally, we possess ancient, extra-biblical parallels for the intimacy of the non-sexual relationship between David and Jonathan, which flies in the face of Horner, who only cites the books of 1 and 2 Samuel in his argument, with the exception of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Frank Moore Cross reminds us and the reader that the Lament of David, although a reference to the relationship between Jonathan and David, the language used in these passages is transparently the language of kinship and mutual kinship obligation. Jonathan loves David as himself, and David's love for Jonathan exceeds that of sexual love. The oath and covenant are binding on the offspring of David and Jonathan, and David is to protect Jonathan's lineage in the event of his death. And Cross wisely posits as well that in life and death, loyalty appropriate to kinsmen is to be kept unbroken, as David addresses Jonathan as my brother. Cross also adds that the language of kinship is used in marriage, adoption, and covenants of individuals and groups, and it is put to use even in parity treaties and vassal treaties negotiated at the international level between independent states and their vassals, and that Cross's argument fits rather well, therefore, with the relationship between David and Jonathan. Now, I understand that kings of the ancient Near East had a council, and we see this in places of the Old Testament, like in 1 Kings 22. However, Dr. Horner is egregiously mistaken to presume that David had a lover in the form of Jonathan, considering the context of 1 Samuel 18 is that of a treaty and loyalty, as Cross has pointed out. Interestingly, both Horner and Fewell omit the usage of the word ahav, which means love, which Dr. Arnold notices has political overtones marked by their covenant in 1 Samuel 18 verse 3. J.A. Thompson noticed the same word used to describe the relationship between Kings David and Hiram in 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 1, whom Hiram always loved, leading Thompson to the conclusion that David and Hiram were more than likely involved in a diplomatic or commercial arrangement rather than an erotically homosexual relationship that Horner and Fewell would seemingly portray. Another example is 2 Samuel 5 verse 11, which refers to the dispatch of messengers, cedar trees, carpenters, and finally masons by Hiram to David for the building of the palace. Particularly interesting is that Hiram greeted Solomon after the death of his father. David, which was in keeping with current political practice, according to which, on the death of one treaty partner and on the enthronement of his successor, the other party to the treaty would send an embassy, according to Thompson. The root of the word ahav, or love, occurs several times in the narratives. This is simply one step in a series leading up to the throne of Israel. Thompson notes a texture of agreements between various parties as David made progress to that throne. One such agreement was with Jonathan here in 1 Samuel 18. The same word is used when Saul made David his armor-bearer, hence the ambiguity in the word, although the word does denote affection between human beings, husband and wife, parent and child, and friend, as the Hallet would suggest. The word, though, does and can have political overtones, and it is used in the above narratives. Dr. Aaron Fleming builds on the work of Thompson and William Moran, whom I haven't mentioned, in that the word ahav, love, has political overtones in passages such as 1 Samuel 19:1 and 1 Samuel verses 23 and 26, which also paint a different picture than the one Horner makes. Horner argues for the erotic or passionate definition of love, and no doubt that is certainly a definition of the word. However, Fleming parts ways with Horner here, as do I, in that the word has a political nuance as well, which again seems more fitting. Her paper, Political Favoritism in Saul's Court, and the relationship between David and Jonathan. Fleming argues that these words, these words, chafatz and na'am, I'll get to the definitions or the meanings of those later, offers support for the political nuance in these passages. Fleming counters Horner, recognizing that the language used to describe the relationship between David and Jonathan has personal dimensions in that ancient Near Eastern or A&E political alliances were often based on kinship and employ familial rhetoric. Therefore, primarily emotive terms can have politicized nuances in certain contexts. Fleming argues that the words chafatz and na'am, both meaning delightful and to delight in, can also have political nuance whilst drawing support from Moran. Initially, Moran argues that love language was a part of the rhetoric of political treaties and alliances, citing numerous examples from A&E political documents spanning both the second and first millennia. Fleming cites an 18th century BCE letter to the king Yasmach Adu, the writer calling himself the one who loves you, indicating his loyalty to the king. Love language was also prevalent in the New Kingdom of Egypt as well, in the Armana letters, and in one letter King Tushratta of Mitanni writes that the alliance existed between his father and Pharaoh, saying, "My father loved you, and you in turn loved my father. In keeping with this love, my father gave you my sister." The reader cannot neglect nor ignore the significance of these examples. Contrary to Horner, the reader cannot deny the political undertones littered throughout these texts, including 1 and 2 Samuel. Fleming goes farther than Moran, though, stating that the people also loved David because of the military successes. Though her argument on the two biblical Hebrew words I've just mentioned, chafatz and na'am, having political nuance goes beyond the scope of this video, it is rather telling that a more convincing case can be made on these or those political overtones. Since the argument relies on the political nuance of these biblical Hebrew words, it equally renders the argument that Jobling puts forth that Saul chides his son for his choice of lover in the form of David is both ridiculous and unconvincing. If these words and context are political in nature, we should review Jobling's remarks that Saul is homophobic. Again, if these words are political, the part of the poem in 1 Samuel 20 verses 30 through 34 must be referring to the depth of the covenant or alliance between both David and Jonathan. Arnold highlights the weakness in both Fewell and Jobling's arguments in that the word for sexual activity, whether heterosexual or homosexual, is the word yada, or the biblical sense of getting to know someone, which is never used to describe the relationship between David and Jonathan. Furthermore, and contrary to Fewell, Arnold argues that the comparison of his relationship with Jonathan is more than likely a reference to 1 Samuel 17 verse 25, when David was under the impression that if he slew Goliath, he would receive the king's daughter. However, David did not receive Michal as his wife immediately, instead emphasizing his covenant or alliance with Jonathan. The writer informs us that because David had not received his bride, that he instead highlights his covenant with Jonathan. What is interesting as well that highlights and supports Fleming's arguments spelled out earlier is Jonathan bestowing his robe, his armor, and his weapons, each having significant value, in 1 Samuel 18. Dr. Johanna von Wijk-Bos posits that this bestowal hints at the accession of David, whilst the center of the unit is taken up with actions of both Saul and Jonathan. Noticeably are Dr. Wijk-Bos's words in which she affirms the covenant or alliance between David and Jonathan are highlighted by the handing over of his royal accoutrements. In other words, this bestowal further highlights the covenant and alliance between the two, much to the chagrin of Saul, who later succumbs to fits of anger and madness because of his envy with David, contrary to Jobling. Conclusion. In conclusion, the relationship between David and Jonathan is not homosexual in nature, but rather a covenantal relationship or an alliance. Doctors Horner and Fewell argue that David and Jonathan had a homosexual relationship, and that the language that the editors of the Old Testament subverted and suppressed, or at least were suppressed and subverted, in an effort to promote the patriarchy. Additionally, Jobling argues that Jonathan, in his decision to ally himself with David, becomes angry, which reflects his homophobia. Contrarily, the language in 1 Samuel 18 reflects language of alliance and covenant. And furthermore, Fleming correctly argues that the words I mentioned earlier possess some sort of political undertone, which equally undermines the idea that the relationship between David and Jonathan was homosexual. Moreover, the normal word for sexual activity, which is yada, or getting to know, or to know, is absent, adds or lends credence to the argument that David and Jonathan did not enter into a homosexual relationship. Well, guys, that concludes this video. So if you guys like this sort of content, I should like to encourage you to again hit that like button and make sure you guys are subscribed in order to receive future notifications on any upcoming videos. And as always, I will list my link in the description for my Patreon and for the sources that I used in this video. And I will see you guys in the next time.